The Battle of Grand Port was a naval battle between squadrons of frigates from the French Navy and the British Royal Navy. The battle was fought during 20 to 27 August 1810 over possession of the harbour of Grand Port on Isle de France during the Napoleonic Wars. The British squadron of 4 frigates sought to blockade the port to prevent his use by the French through the capture of the fortified Isle de la Passe at its entrance. This position was seized by a British landing party on 13 August, and when a French squadron under Captain Guy Victor Duperrey approached the bay 9 days later, the British commander, Captain Samuel Pym, decided to lure them into coastal waters where his superior numbers could be brought to bear against the French ships. 4 of the 5 French ships managed to break past the British blockade, taking shelter in the protected anchorage, which was only accessible through a series of complicated reefs and sandbanks that were impassable without an experienced harbour pilot. When Pym ordered his frigates to attack the anchored French on August 22 and 23, his ships became trapped in the narrow channels of the bay. 2 were irretrievably grounded, a third, outnumbered by the combined French squadron, was defeated, and a fourth was unable to close to within effective gun range. Although the French ships were also badly damaged, the battle was a disaster for the British. 1 ship was captured after suffering irreparable damage. The grounded ships were set on fire to prevent their capture by French boarding parties, and the remaining vessel was seized as it left the harbour by the main French squadron from Port Napoleon under Commodore Jacques Hamelin. The British defeat was the worst the Royal Navy suffered during the entire war, and it left the Indian Ocean and its vital trade convoys exposed to attack from Hamelin's frigates. In response, the British authorities sought to reinforce the squadron on Isle Bourbon under Josias Rowley by ordering all available ships to the region. But this piecemeal reinforcement resulted in a series of desperate actions as individual British ships were attacked by the more powerful and confident French squadron. In December 1810 an adequate reinforcement was collected, with the provision of a strong battle squadron under Admiral Albert Alberti, that rapidly invaded and subdued Isle de France. Background. During the early 19th century, the Indian Ocean formed an essential part of the network of trade routes that connected the British Empire. Heavily laden East Indiamen travelled from British Indian port cities such as Bombay or Calcutta to the United Kingdom, carrying millions of pounds worth of goods. From Britain, the ships returned on the same routes, often carrying soldiers for the growing British Indian Army, then under the control of the Honourable East India Company. Following the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars in 1803, the British Admiralty had made the security of these routes a priority, and by 1807 the Dutch bases at the Cape of Good Hope and Java had been neutralised by expeditionary forces to prevent their use by enemy raiders. The French Indian Ocean possessions, however, principally Isle Bonaparte and Isle de France, were a more complicated target, protected from attack not only by the great distances involved in preparing an invasion attempt but also by heavy fortifications and a substantial garrison of French army soldiers augmented by a large local militia. The French had recognized the importance of these islands as bases for raiding warships during the French Revolutionary Wars, but by late 1807 the only naval resources allocated to the region were a few older frigates and a large number of local privateers. Following the reduction of these remaining naval forces on Isle de France during 1808, by defeat in battle and disarmaments due to age and unseaworthiness, the French naval authorities made a serious attempt to disrupt British trade in the region, ordering 5 large modern frigates to sail to Isle de France under Commodore Jacques Hamelin. 4 of these ships broke through the British blockade of the French coast, arriving in the Indian Ocean in the spring of 1809, where Hamelin dispersed him into the Bay of Bengal with orders to intercept, attack and capture or destroy the heavily armed but extremely valuable convoys of East Indiamen. The first French success came at the end of the spring, when the frigate Caroline successfully attacked a convoy at the action of 31 May 1809, seizing two heavily laden merchant ships. Commodore Josias Rowley was given command of the British response to the French deployment. A hastily assembled force composed mainly of those ships available at the Cape of Good Hope in early 1809, ordered to stop the French raiders. Rowley was unable to spread his limited squadron wide enough to pursue the roving French frigates, instead using his forces to blockade and raid the French Indian Ocean islands in anticipation of Hamlin's return. In August 1809, Caroline arrived with her prizes at St. Paul on Isle Bonaparte, and Rowley determined to seize the frigate. He planned a successful invasion of the town, launched on 20 September 1809, which resulted in the capture of the port's defences, Caroline, and the capture of the East Indiamen. With his objectives complete, Rowley withdrew 5 days later. Almost a year later, Rowley returned with a larger task force and made a second landing around the capital of Isle Bonaparte, St. Denis. Marching on the seat of government, Rowley's troops rapidly overwhelmed the defences and forced the island's garrison to surrender, renaming the island Isle Bourbon and installing a British governor. Hamlin had used the British preoccupation with Isle Bonaparte to send additional frigates to sea during 1809 and early 1810, including his flagship Aquitaine, which captured 3 East Indiamen at the action of 18 November 1809, and Bellona, which took the Portuguese frigate Minerva in the Bay of Bengal a few days later. Minerva, renamed Minerve in French hands, was subsequently involved in the action of 3 July 1810, when a further 2 East Indiamen were captured. The squadron in the latter action was commanded by Guy Victor Duperrey in Bellona, whose ships were so badly damaged that Duperrey was forced to spend nearly a month repairing his vessels in the Comoros Islands before they were ready to return to Ile-de-France. Operations off Grand Port. With Isle Bourbon secured in July 1810, the British now occupied a large fortified island base within easy sailing distance of Ile-de-France. Even before Isle Bourbon was completely in British hands, Rowley had detached HMS Sirius from the invasion squadron with orders to restore the blockade of Ile-de-France. Shortly afterwards, Sirius's captain Samuel Pym led his men in a raid on a coastal vessel moored off the southern side of the island. 2 days after this successful operation, reinforcements arrived in the form of the frigates HMS Iphigenia, HMS Nereida and the small brig HMS Staunch. Nereida carried 100 specially selected soldiers from the 69th and 33rd Regiments and some artillerymen from the garrison at Madras, to be used in storming and garrisoning offshore islands, beginning with Isle de la Passe off Grand Port, a well-defended islet that protected a natural harbour on the southeastern shore. These fortified islands could be used to block entry to the ports of Ile-de-France and thus trap Hamlin's squadron. Grand Port was an easily defendable natural harbour because the bay was protected from the open sea by a large coral reef through which a complicated channel meandered. Known only to experienced local pilots, Isle de la Passe was vitally important in the control of Grand Port because it featured a heavy battery that covered the entrance to the channel, thus controlling the passage to the sheltered inner lagoon. The British planned to use the troops on Nereida, under her captain Nesbit Willoughby, to storm Isle de la Passe and capture the battery. Willoughby would then use a local man serving on his ship named John Johnson, to steer through the channel and land troops near the town, distributing leaflets promising freedom and prosperity under British rule in an attempt to corrode the morale of the defenders. The first attack on Isle de la Passe was launched on the evening of 10 August, with staunch towing boats carrying over 400 soldiers, Royal Marines and volunteer sailors to the island under cover of darkness, guided by Nereida's pilot. During the night, however, the pilot became lost and the boats were scattered in high winds and had not reassembled by dawn. To distract French attention from the drifting boats, Pym directed Captain Henry Lambert in Iphigenia to sail conspicuously off Port Napoleon, where the main body of the French squadron, led by Hamelin in VQ-10Us, was based. Pym joined Lambert later in the day and the frigates subsequently returned to the waters of Grand Port by different routes, confusing French observers from the shore as to British intentions. By the 13th of August, the boats originally intended for the attack had still not been assembled and Pym decided that he could not risk waiting any longer without the French launching a counterattack. Launching his own boats at 8 p.m., guided by the pilot and commanded by Pym's second-in-command, Lieutenant Norman. Pym's marines and sailors landed on the island in darkness under heavy fire from the defenders. Norman was killed in the initial exchange of fire, but his deputy Lieutenant Watling seized the island by storming the fortifications surrounding the battery. 7 British personnel were killed and 18 wounded in the battle, in which the storming party managed to seize intact French naval code books and took 80 prisoners. Willoughby was furious that Pym had assumed command of the operation without his permission, and the officers exchanged angry letters, part of an ongoing disagreement between them that engendered mutual distrust. With Isle de la Passe secure, Pym gave command of the blockade of Grand Port to Willoughby and returned to his station off Port Napoleon with Iphigenia. Willoughby used his independent position to raid the coastline, landing at Point du Diable on the 17th of August on the northern edge of Grand Port with 170 men and storming the fort there, destroying 10 cannon and capturing another. Marching south towards the town of Grand Port itself, Willoughby's men fought off French counterattacks and distributed propaganda pamphlets at the farms and villages they passed. Willoughby re-embarked his troops in the evening but landed again the following day at Grande Riviere to observe the effects of his efforts. Burning a signal station, Willoughby advanced inland, but was checked by the arrival of 800 French reinforcements from Port Napoleon and returned to HMS Nereida. The brief expedition cost the British 2 men wounded and 1 missing, to French casualties of at least 10 killed or wounded. Willoughby followed the attack on Grande Riviere with unopposed minor landings on 19 and 20 August. Duperrey's arrival. Willoughby's raiding was interrupted at 1000 on 20 August when 5 ships were sighted, rapidly approaching from the southeast. Following a month of repairs on Anjouan, Duperrey had sailed for Ile-de-France without encountering any opposition on his return passage, and was intending to enter Grand Port via the channel protected by Isle de la Passe. Duperrey was unaware of the British occupation of the island, and Willoughby intended to lure the French squadron into the channel by concealing the British presence off the harbour. Once there, Willoughby hoped to defeat them or damage them so severely that they would be unable to break out unaided, thus isolating Duperrey's squadron from Hamelin's force in Port Napoleon and containing the French in separate harbours to prevent him from concentrating against the British blockade squadrons. Willoughby brought Nereida close to Isle de la Passe to combine their fire and protect his boats, which were carrying 160 men back to Nereida from a raid near Grand Port that morning. Raising a French tricolour over Isle de la Passe and on Nereida, Willoughby transmitted the French code captured on the island, "Le ennemi croise au coin de mire," and received an acknowledgement from Duperrey. The use of these signals convinced Duperrey, over the objections of Captain Pierre Bouvet on Minerve, that Nereida was Surcouf's privateer Charles, which was expected from France. The French squadron closed with the harbour during the morning, Victor entering the channel under Isle de la Passe at 1340. Willoughby sent boats to attempt to take possession of Victor, but they were unable to reach the vessel. Behind the corvette, Minerve in Ceylon pushed into the channel and signalled Maurice to follow them, exchanging fire with the fort. As Morris raised his colors again and followed Minerve, a large explosion boiled out of Isle de la Passe, where the false French flag had ignited on a brazier as it was lowered and set fire to a nearby stack of cartridges, which exploded in the close confines of the fort. 3 men were killed and 12 badly burned, 6 cannon were dismounted and 1 discharged unexpectedly, killing a British sailor in a boat attempting to board Victor. With the fort out of action and a significant number of her crew scattered in small boats in the channel, Nereida alone was unable to block French entry to Grand Port. With Willoughby's ambush plan ruined, the scattered boats sought to rejoin Nereida, passing directly through the French squadron. Although several boats were in danger of being run down by the French ships and one even bumped alongside Minerve, all eventually rejoined Nereida safely. However, the opportunity to cause significant damage to the French in the narrow channel had been lost, Bellona joining the squadron in passing through the channel with minimal resistance. In addition to British losses in the explosion at the fort, 2 men had been killed and 1 wounded on Nereida. French losses were more severe, Minerve suffering 23 casualties and Ceylon 8. With both sides recognizing that further action was inevitable, Willoughby sent a boat to Sirius requesting additional assistance, and Duperrey sent a message overland with Lieutenant Morris, requesting support from Hamlin's squadron. Commander Victor passed to Henry Moisson. In the afternoon, Willoughby used mortars on Isle de la Passe to shell the French squadron, forcing Duperrey to retreat into the shallow harbour at Grand Port, and Willoughby subsequently sent officers into Grand Port on the 21st of August under a flag of truce, demanding the release of Victor, which he insisted had surrendered and should thus be handed over to the blockade squadron as a prize. Duperrey refused to consider the request. 1 French ship had failed to enter the channel off Grand Port, the captured East Indiaman Wyndham. Early on the 21st of August, her French commander attempted to shelter in Rivière Noire. Sirius spotted the merchant ship under the batteries there and sent 2 boats into the anchorage, stormed the ship and brought her out without a single casualty. This success was remarkable as the boarding party had forgotten to take any weapons with them and were only armed with wooden foot stretchers wielded as clubs.